All right, let's dive deep today. We're tackling, are we living in a simulation? And we're going to use the Embodied Predictive Global Workspace, the EPGW, right, to really unpack all of this.
Yeah. What's really interesting about the EPGW is it doesn't shy away from the big questions. Like, how does our subjective experience, like what it feels like to be you or me, how does that connect to what's physically happening in our brains?
So it takes like the philosophy of consciousness and tries to ground it in actual neuroscience, right? I mean, I was reading about dual aspect monism.
Right.
And this is like the idea that the mental and the physical, they're not separate. They're two sides of the same coin, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of thinking about your mind as separate from your brain, EPGW suggests that they're intertwined, like two aspects of the same fundamental reality. And then if you think about how that plays into the simulation hypothesis, maybe our simulated reality, if we are in one, isn't some separate like digital realm, but it's another aspect of the same fundamental stuff that, you know, that makes up our consciousness.
Okay, yeah, that's already pretty trippy. But then there's this whole concept of prediction errors.
Yeah.
And like our brains are constantly making predictions.
Yeah.
And it's actually those errors, those things that don't match up, that make us aware of things.
Right.
Like our brain is playing a guessing game with reality, I guess.
Yeah. Think about, you know, you're walking down the street and you're not really paying attention to what's around you. You're just lost in thought. And then all of a sudden, a car swerves up onto the sidewalk and it's heading right towards you.
Yeah.
That's an unexpected event. Like, that's a prediction error, and it jolts you into awareness. Like, your brain is like, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't match what I was predicting. Pay attention.
Right, right. So then if we are in a simulation, could those be like glitches in the matrix? Would those like manifest as like really, really intense prediction errors where our brains are picking up on something that's like off about reality?
That's a really interesting thought. Like, if the simulation isn't perfect, if there are little imperfections or inconsistencies, those could like manifest as experiences that really violate our brain's predictions. So we have this heightened sense of awareness and makes you wonder, like, are those moments of deja vu or those weird coincidences we experience, are those just like tiny glitches in the simulation?
Whoa, that's getting a little too trippy, even for me. But EPGW, it goes even deeper than that.
Yeah.
Right? It talks about embodied cognition.
Yeah.
So, like, our bodies are not just vehicles for our brains. Our bodies actually play a role in shaping consciousness.
Right. So EPGW emphasizes that the physical interactions that we have with the world through our senses and movements, that's actually fundamental to how our brains learn and adapt and how we create our experience of reality.
So it's not just the brain in a jar.
Exactly.
That classic thought experiment. So then, if our consciousness is so intertwined with our physical bodies,
Right.
I mean, what does that even mean for like a simulated consciousness?
Right.
Could a simulated being, like existing purely in the digital world, could it truly be conscious if it didn't have a body, or at least a simulated body, to interact with its environment?
That is where things get really, really interesting. Because, you know, EPGW makes us question whether a purely disembodied consciousness, like, is that even possible? It suggests that to be truly conscious, to experience the world in a meaningful way, you need embodiment. Even if it's like a virtual embodiment, you need some kind of embodiment.
Okay, so like my mind is officially blown. And then just when I thought it couldn't get any weirder, we got to talk about BrainLM, this AI that's helping scientists study and refine the EPGW. It's this whole other layer of, whoa, this is real to the whole thing.
Yeah, BrainLM is a game changer because it's a computational model that can actually simulate brain activity.
Yeah.
And it can analyze those prediction errors that we were talking about. And it can even model like embodied interactions with an environment. So it's giving us this really concrete data that's helping us understand how consciousness might actually work, not just in theory, but in practice.
So we have the framework, the EPGW,
Right.
that tries to explain consciousness.
All right.
And we have BrainLM, this AI,
Right.
that's helping us test it out and refine it. It's like science fiction is becoming reality right in front of us.
Yeah.
But how does BrainLM actually connect to the simulation hypothesis?
Yeah.
I mean, could it be used to create a simulation, one that's so realistic that it actually gives rise to conscious beings?
I mean, that's a question that researchers are actively exploring right now, because if BrainLM can simulate neural activity that accurately, then could we use it to create a simulated world? that's populated by simulated beings with simulated brains, each of them experiencing their own version of reality?
Yeah.
And if so, would those beings be conscious in the same way that we are?
Yeah, I'm getting chills just thinking about that. Like,
Yeah.
we're on the verge of creating, like, our own mini matrix
Right.
populated by AI entities that could potentially become self-aware.
Yeah. It raises some really profound ethical questions, for sure, but it also just highlights how incredible and powerful this EPGW is. Like, it's not just a theoretical framework. It's an actual tool that we can use to explore the very nature of consciousness, not just biological, but also artificial consciousness.
This is definitely making me rethink, like, my whole concept of reality. But before we get too carried away with all of the mind-blowing possibilities, let's bring it back to the EPGW and its implications for the simulation hypothesis. How does this framework actually help us understand the possibility of living in a simulation?
Well, the EPGW offers a way to think about consciousness in any environment, simulated or not. And it suggests that those key elements of consciousness, like prediction errors and that global workspace dynamic and embodied cognition, they could all exist within a simulation just as they do in the world that we perceive as real.
So even in a simulated world, our brains would still be making predictions, experiencing those errors, interacting with the environment. It's just that the environment itself is digital.
Exactly. And that's like a really crucial point because it challenges this notion that a simulated consciousness would be somehow less real or less valid than a biological one. The EPGW suggests that consciousness is more about the processes, the dynamics, the interactions, regardless of the underlying substrate.
Okay, so whether our brains are made of neurons or ones and zeros, the underlying principles of consciousness could still apply. That's a pretty radical concept.
Sure.
But let's be real, EPGW is a complex framework. And there's got to be some pushback. Like some people say, like, hey, this is too abstract. Like, how do we know any of this is true?
Yeah, absolutely. The EPGW is a relatively new framework. And like any good scientific theory, it's met with a healthy dose of skepticism. You know, some people find that concept of dual aspect monism just too abstract. Others question whether prediction errors are really the be all end all of consciousness.
And then there's the whole embodiment thing.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about how the EPGW sees the body as essential for consciousness. But couldn't someone argue that that limits the framework? Like, what about forms of consciousness that might not have physical bodies, like a disembodied AI or, even spiritual entities?
Right. That's a really valid point. And it's something that researchers are, actively exploring. The EPGW, as it is right now, does emphasize the importance of embodiment. But it also recognizes that embodiment can take different forms and that ultimately it's about the interaction between an entity and its environment, whether that environment is physical or virtual.
So even a simulated being with a virtual body could still experience embodiment in a broader sense.
Exactly.
It's how that being interacts with its environment, regardless of whether that environment is made of atoms or bits.
Exactly. And that's what makes the EPGW such a powerful tool for thinking about the simulation hypothesis, because it suggests that these principles of consciousness aren't just limited to biological beings in a physical world. They could apply to any entity in any environment that has the right kind of complexity and interaction.
Okay. I'm starting to see how the EPGW offers this incredibly flexible and nuanced way of looking at consciousness.
Yeah.
It's not just about neurons firing in a brain. It's about this interplay of information and prediction and embodiment, regardless of the underlying substrate.
Exactly.
And that opens up a whole world of possibilities. It allows us to think about consciousness in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
Right. Yeah, it's a whole new way of thinking about consciousness. It really challenges us to reconsider those big questions. What is reality? What does it mean to be conscious? And what are the limits of possibility?
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling existential right now. But, speaking of limits, I've been wondering about the practical side of this. We talked about how BrainLM is being used to study the EPGW and even simulate neural activity. But what about the simulation hypothesis itself? Is there any way to actually test whether we are living in a simulation?
Yes. The quest for the red pill. Right.
Right, exactly.
It's a question that's been captivating philosophers and scientists for a long time. And while we don't have a definitive answer, there are some intriguing avenues of exploration, some physicists have proposed that we should be looking for these subtle inconsistencies in the laws of physics, tiny glitches that might suggest that our reality isn't as real as we think it is.
So cracks in the matrix.
Yeah, exactly.
Little hints that the code isn't perfect.
Right. Another idea is that if our universe is a simulation, it might have like a limited resolution. Like, think of it like a video game that has a certain number of pixels. So if we could probe the fabric of reality at a fine enough scale, we might be able to detect those fundamental units of the simulation.
Okay, now that is blowing my mind. Imagine like zooming in on reality and seeing the pixels, the building blocks of the simulation.
Right. It would definitely be paradigm shifting. But for now, these are still, largely theoretical concepts. Like, we don't have the technology to test these ideas yet, but who knows what the future holds?
Right. I guess that's part of the fun of it. We're pushing those boundaries, venturing into the unknown. But let's not get like too lost in hypotheticals. Even if we can't definitively prove that we're in a simulation, the EPGW still gives us this framework for understanding how consciousness could work in a simulated environment. And that has some pretty profound implications, right?
Absolutely. Like, if consciousness isn't necessarily tied to any specific physical substrate, then it could theoretically exist in a simulated world just as it does in the world that we perceive as real. And that raises all sorts of ethical questions, too. Like, if we were to create a simulation that's populated with conscious beings, what responsibilities would we have towards those beings?
Yeah, whoa, that's heavy. It's like we're on the verge of becoming like digital gods, creating these worlds and potentially even life within those worlds.
Right. And it's a responsibility that we shouldn't take lightly. If we're going to create simulated consciousness, we need to make sure that those beings are treated ethically.
Yeah.
That they're not subjected to suffering or exploitation.
It's like we need a whole new set of ethical guidelines for the digital age.
Right.
Ones that like acknowledge the potential for consciousness in these non-biological entities.
Yeah, exactly. It's a conversation that we need to start having now before our technology outpaces our ethical understanding. But the ethical implications of EPGW, they go beyond just simulations. It also makes us rethink our relationships with other forms of consciousness that are already here, like, animal intelligence.
Oh, that's interesting. How does EPGW change how we view animal consciousness?
Well, EPGW, with this emphasis on embodiment and prediction and interaction, it suggests that consciousness isn't just a uniquely human thing. It's more like a spectrum, a continuum that exists across the entire animal kingdom. Different species exhibit different levels of complexity and awareness.
It's not a question of whether animals are conscious, but like how conscious they are.
Yeah.
And what kinds of experiences they might be having.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for how we treat animals, how we interact with them, and how we understand our place in the web of life.
Right. Yeah. It's a good reminder that we're not the only conscious beings on this planet.
Yeah.
And that we have a responsibility to like respect and protect that diversity of life, even in its non-human forms. But, as we're talking about these different levels of consciousness, I can't help but think about the hard problem of consciousness that we talked about before. The question of why subjective experience exists at all. Does the EPGW offer any insights into that mystery?
The hard problem, that's a tough one. It really is. It's a question of why we have subjective experience, why we feel things, why we perceive the world, why there's this what it's like to be us. And while the EPGW might not provide like a definitive answer to that question, it does offer a new perspective. It suggests that consciousness is more of an emergent property of these complex dynamic processes that we've been talking about. Prediction, error correction, embodiment, and the global workspace dynamics.
So instead of trying to explain consciousness as like this separate, mysterious entity, the EPGW is grounding it in these, observable, measurable processes that we can actually study.
Exactly. It's more about understanding how the brain actually works, how it interacts with the body and the environment, and how all of those interactions give rise to our subjective experience. It's not about solving the hard problem in a philosophical sense, but more about understanding the mechanisms, the processes that underlie consciousness.
Yeah, I like that. It's a more pragmatic approach, one that's rooted in, science and observation rather than just speculation.
Right. And that's what makes the EPGW so exciting. It's giving us new tools, new ways of thinking about consciousness, and new avenues for exploration. But even with all of these advances, there's still this sense of mystery, a sense of awe that surrounds consciousness. It's something that we're only beginning to understand. There's so much more out there to discover.
Yeah, it's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion. And with each layer we uncover, we find more complexity, more wonder, more questions. But that's what makes this journey so fascinating. It's the pursuit, the exploration, this endless quest for understanding that makes consciousness research so compelling.
Exactly. And I love that about the EPGW. Like, it's not the static theory. It's this dynamic framework that's constantly evolving as we gather more data, more insights. It's an invitation to think bigger, to question deeper, and to embrace the unknown.
Speaking of embracing the unknown, let's talk about those everyday experiences that often seem really mysterious, like creativity and intuition. Does the EPGW offer any insights into how those processes work?
Ah, yes. Creativity and intuition. Those are the elusive aspects of human cognition that often seem to defy explanation. But the EPGW, with its emphasis on prediction and error correction, might actually be able to shed some light on these mysteries.
How so? Does it suggest that creativity is just like a form of prediction error?
It's a little more nuanced than that. The
Right.
EPGW suggests that creativity might involve the brain's ability to make these unexpected connections, to break free from those well-worn neural pathways, and to, explore new possibilities.
So it's about those aha moments.
Yes.
Those flashes of insight that seem to come out of nowhere.
Exactly.
Like the brain is suddenly making a leap, a connection that it hadn't considered before.
Right. And those moments might be a result of the brain's prediction mechanisms working in a more flexible, more exploratory way. So instead of just trying to predict the most likely outcome, the brain is allowing itself to consider those more unusual possibilities, to kind of venture off the beaten path.
That's really cool. So creativity isn't just about generating random ideas. It's about the brain's ability to break free from its own expectations and explore new territory.
Exactly. And BrainLM could be an incredible tool for studying these processes. By analyzing brain activity during creative tasks, we might be able to identify those neural patterns that precede those moments of insight, those creative breakthroughs.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the inner workings of the creative mind,
Right.
seeing how the brain orchestrates these, magical leaps of imagination.
Exactly. And it's not just about creativity either. Intuition, those gut feelings that often guide our decisions, might also be understood through the lens of EPGW. It suggests that intuition might be a result of the brain processing information below the level of conscious awareness.
So our unconscious mind is constantly working, making connections and processing information, even when we're not aware of it.
Exactly. And those unconscious processes might be what gives rise to those intuitive insights, those hunches that we can't quite explain but often turn out to be right.
It's like there's this whole other level of processing going on beneath the surface, a hidden world of neural activity that's shaping our thoughts and our feelings and even our decisions.
Right. And BrainLM could be the key to unlocking those hidden worlds. By analyzing brain activity, we might be able to detect patterns that precede those moments of intuition, even if the person isn't consciously aware of those patterns.
It's like we're starting to crack the code of the unconscious mind, understanding how these hidden processes influence our conscious experience.
Exactly. And that understanding could have profound implications for, everything from how we make decisions to creativity to our understanding of the nature of consciousness itself.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But before we get too lost in the depths of the unconscious, let's bring it back to the simulation hypothesis. We talked about how the EPGW could apply to a simulated world. But I'm curious, are there any specific aspects of the EPGW that might make it easier or more likely for consciousness to arise in a simulation?
That's a really interesting question. One aspect of the EPGW that might be particularly relevant to the simulation hypothesis is this emphasis on information processing. The EPGW sees consciousness as arising from the brain's ability to process information, make predictions, and resolve errors.
So if consciousness is fundamentally about information processing, then it stands to reason that it could emerge in any system, simulated or otherwise, that's capable of, sophisticated information processing.
That's one line of thinking, and it ties into that idea of substrate independence that we were discussing earlier. The EPGW suggests that these principles of consciousness aren't tied to any particular physical material. It's about the processes, not the stuff that it's made of.
So theoretically, those processes could be running on silicon chips just as well as they run on neurons.
Exactly. And that's a pretty mind-blowing concept to consider, especially in the context of the simulation hypothesis.
Right. We're talking about the possibility of simulated worlds that are not only realistic, but also capable of giving rise to, conscious entities. It's a whole new frontier of exploration, one that raises both profound questions and exciting possibilities. But before we get completely lost in hypotheticals, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment and talk about the concrete implications of EPGW and BrainLM for understanding the human brain.
Yeah, you're right. It's important to remember that while the simulation hypothesis is fun to ponder, there's a lot of groundbreaking work happening right now using these frameworks to understand and improve human lives. We mentioned neurorehabilitation earlier, but there are also some exciting advances happening in the field of mental health.
Oh, that's interesting. How is the EPGW being used to understand and treat mental health conditions?
Well, many mental health conditions, like anxiety and depression, they involve these disruptions in the brain's prediction mechanisms. For example, someone with anxiety might constantly be predicting negative outcomes, even in situations where those outcomes are really unlikely.
So their brain is like stuck in this loop of anticipating the worst, even when there's no real evidence to support those fears.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And BrainLM can help us understand how those patterns of prediction and error resolution are like playing out in the brains of individuals with mental health conditions.
So instead of just relying on, self-reported symptoms, we're getting a more objective view of what's happening at the neural level.
Exactly. And that deeper understanding can then lead to more targeted and more effective treatments. For example, BrainLM could be used to develop these personalized interventions that help retrain those maladaptive prediction patterns.
So it's about teaching the brain to make more accurate and ultimately more helpful predictions.
Yeah.
To break free from those, negative thought loops.
Right, that's the goal. And what's great about this approach is that it's rooted in neuroscience, not just in subjective interpretations of behavior or symptoms. It's about understanding those underlying mechanisms of mental health conditions and then using that knowledge to develop better treatments.
It's like we're finally starting to crack the code of the brain thanks to these frameworks like the EPGW and tools like BrainLM. But it's not just about treating mental health conditions. It's also about understanding how our brains shape our perceptions of the world, our beliefs, and even our sense of self.
Absolutely. The EPGW emphasizes that our brains are constantly constructing our reality based on our past experiences, our predictions, and our interactions with the environment. It's a reminder that what we perceive as reality is really a product of our brains, not just this passive reflection of the world outside of us.
So we're not just observers of reality, we're active participants in creating it.
That's a key insight from EPGW, and it has profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
It makes you wonder, if our brains are constantly shaping our reality, how much control do we really have over our perceptions, our beliefs, and even our sense of self?
That's a question philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries. And while the EPGW doesn't give us any, definitive answers, it does offer a framework for exploring those questions from a neuroscientific perspective.
It's a reminder that we're still in the early stages of understanding the brain and how it shapes our experience of the world. But with tools like EPGW and BrainLM, we're making some pretty incredible strides. And it's those strides, those leaps in understanding, that are pushing us to re-examine our assumptions about what it means to be human, what it means to be conscious, and what the future might hold.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be studying the brain and consciousness. Who knows what the future holds with all these advances we're making?
I know, right? The possibilities are pretty mind-blowing. But for now, let's bring it back down to earth a bit. We've talked about how the EPGW is being used to understand mental health and things like neurorehabilitation. But what about those everyday human experiences, like creativity and intuition? Can the EPGW help us understand those too?
Well, creativity and intuition, those are pretty tricky concepts to pin down, right?
Yeah.
But the EPGW might offer some insights. For instance, some researchers believe that creativity could be linked to the brain's ability to make these unexpected connections, to see patterns where others don't.
So those aha moments,
Exactly.
like those flashes of insight that seemingly come out of nowhere.
Right, and those moments might be happening because the brain's prediction mechanisms are actually working in a more flexible way, a more exploratory way. So instead of just trying to predict the most likely outcome, the brain is kind of letting itself consider these more unusual possibilities, exploring those less traveled neural pathways.
So creativity isn't just about generating random ideas. It's about the brain being able to kind of break free from its own expectations and explore new
Right.
territory.
Exactly. And we could actually use BrainLM to study those processes in more detail, to see how the brain generates those creative sparks.
That's pretty amazing. What about intuition, though? Is there any way to understand those gut feelings, those seemingly unconscious insights through the lens of the EPGW?
Well, intuition is another one of those tough concepts to really grasp, but the EPGW suggests it might be a result of the brain processing information, but below the level of conscious awareness. Remember, the EPGW really emphasizes how much our brains are doing behind the scenes.
Right. We're only consciously aware of this tiny fraction of what our brain is actually processing at any given moment. So you're saying those intuitive insights might be a result of those unconscious processes kind of bubbling up to the surface.
That's one possibility. And BrainLM could help us explore this further. By analyzing brain activity, we might be able to actually detect patterns that come right before those moments of intuition, even if the person themselves isn't consciously aware of them.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into those hidden workings of the mind, the processes that are shaping our thoughts and feelings, even our behaviors, without us even knowing it. It's pretty wild. But, as we dig deeper into all these concepts, I keep coming back to this idea of consciousness as a spectrum. We've talked about AI potentially developing consciousness and the possibility that simulated beings could experience emotions. But what about other forms of intelligence, like animal intelligence? Could the EPGW help us understand consciousness in non-human animals, too?
That's a great question. And it's definitely one that's at the forefront of consciousness research right now. The EPGW, with its focus on prediction, embodiment, and those global workspace dynamics, it's a framework that could potentially apply to any system that has that complex information processing, regardless of whether it's biological or not.
So it's not limited to brains with a certain number of neurons or a specific structure. It's more about those principles of information processing, not the physical hardware itself.
Exactly. And that's what's so powerful about the EPGW. It offers us this way to study consciousness across different species, to look for those common threads that might underlie conscious experience in all its different forms.
That's really exciting. It's like we're finally starting to break free from those human-centered biases that have kind of limited our understanding of consciousness for so long. But it also raises some ethical questions too, right? If we acknowledge that other animals might be conscious, does that change how we should be treating them?
It's a really important question that we need to be asking ourselves. The EPGW, by providing a framework for understanding animal consciousness, is pushing us to really reconsider our ethical obligations to other species. It's a reminder that we're not the only beings on this planet who have rich inner lives and the capacity for experience.
It's definitely a humbling thought. And it challenges us to broaden our circle of compassion, to recognize those shared threads of consciousness that connect us to all living beings, not just humans. It makes you wonder, what is it that makes any of us conscious in the first place?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that the EPGW doesn't try to shy away from. It suggests that consciousness comes from that complex interplay of prediction, error correction, embodiment, and the global workspace. But it also acknowledges that there's so much we still don't know.
It's like we're trying to put together this giant puzzle, and we found some of the pieces. But there are still a lot of missing pieces out there.
Exactly. But the EPGW gives us a framework, a structure to work with. It helps us organize those pieces that we do have to see how they might fit together, and it can guide our search for the missing ones. And as we continue to explore the EPGW, to refine it, to test it, we're bound to make even more groundbreaking discoveries about the nature of consciousness.
So it's not a finished product.
No.
It's more like this ongoing process of discovery and exploration.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting to be working in this field. We're on the cutting edge of a whole new era of consciousness research, one that has the potential to completely transform our understanding of ourselves, our place in the universe, and the very nature of reality.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating journey exploring the brain, the simulation hypothesis, and the ethical considerations of creating artificial consciousness.
It really has.
To our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and maybe even challenged some of your assumptions, leaving you with a sense of wonder about the nature of consciousness.
And remember, the pursuit of understanding is always a journey worth taking, even if those answers aren't always clear. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep embracing the mystery.
And as always, keep diving deep.